When Celeste Lassiter Massey is forced to live with her actress Aunt Valentina in Harlem, she is not thrilled to trade her friends and comfortable North Carolina surroundings for a scary big city life. Things are not at all what they seem, however, as she quickly discovers. While Celeste absorbs the excitement of the Harlem Renaissance, she sees as much grit as she does glamour. A talented violinist and aspiring doctor, she must eventually face a choice between ambition and loyalty, roots and new horizons. The decision will change her forever. Here is a preview of Celeste's Harlem Renaissance by Eleanora E. Tate. Scoot your big bucket over, Cece, and let me have more room, Evelina yelled. I'd settled myself into the Bivens's wagon first, but I moved closer to Angel May. Evelina was the kind of girl who had to have her way. She'd have sat on me otherwise. Lissa, the Bivens's mean albino mule, swung her head around in her straw hat and glared at us. Please don't get this mule riled up, Mrs. Bivens said and puffed on her pipe. About the only time she wants to move is when she sees me pack my herb bags in the wagon. Then she won't take more'n 10 steps until we stick sprigs of sage in her hat. She likes the smell of sage. I'm down to my last leaves. My neighbor, Mrs. Smithfield, in the front seat by Mrs. Bivens, glanced around at us too. She was a short, pleasant-faced woman with gray eyes, and so fair-skinned that she was often mistaken for being white. Everybody ready? Leon couldn't come. All right, they're ready. She straightened her woolen cap on her head and pulled her heavy coat closer around her. When Mrs. Bivens clucked and snapped the reins, Lissa brayed, then slowly clopped off. Cece, put that bonnet on. Aunt Society's clackerbell tongue followed us. You don't need to get any darker from this sun, even if it is chilly. I snatched off my red and white cap and slapped the scratchy gray woolen bonnet onto my head, while Evelina snickered. Mrs. Bivens grunted. Leave it to Aunt Society to embarrass me in front of everybody. I hated that old bonnet. I'd take it off and put my cap back on after I got out of her sight. Aunt Society would go up to heaven, or down to the devil's pit of never-ending fire, criticizing my dark skin color. She allowed that she was tangerine-colored, and was she ever proud of that? To me, she just looked wrinkled-up orange. But this was a special Sunday, and I wasn't going to let either my aunt or the sun ruin it. I was a winner. Me, Evelina, Angel May, and Leon had written winning essays about our state capital in the annual contest sponsored by our Butterflies Club at school. Mrs. Smithfield, who was a cook for the governor, was taking us winners on a tour of our state capital here in Raleigh right now. This was a great honor, our teacher, Mrs. Bracy, kept telling us, because not many colored children got to see the inside of the Capitol up close like we would. Land's sake, I'd never won anything before. Mama was smiling down at me from heaven, and Papa was proud of me. Aunt Society hadn't said a word. When we drove up Hargett Street past the colored section of City Cemetery, I looked over toward where Mama and my baby brother Emmanuel lay, like I always did. Grandma and Grandpa Lassiter, Mama's parents, were in there too. Mama stayed sickly after Emmanuel's birth, but I didn't hold it against him. He passed a week later. That was 4 years ago, when I was 9 years old. I promised Mama in her last days before she passed on 2 years ago that I would take good care of Papa, and I will, no matter what. He and Aunt Society were the only family I had left. Well, I had Aunt Valentina Lassiter, Mama's younger sister, but she lived in New York City. We passed Hamlin's Drug, the Masonic Hall, the Royal Theatre, and the Stackhouse Hotel, where Papa worked. I waved in case he was looking out a window. Hope he wasn't coughing. He'd had a bad bout this morning when he woke up. Now, children, look to your manners, Mrs. Smithfield was saying. Anybody with gum or candy in her mouth, swallow it now. And don't touch anything. We want those guards to see you three are the best behaved colored girls in Raleigh. We said, yes, ma'am. My stomach was squeezed into knots, like it got whenever I went around strange people and places. Aunt Society said that was due to either the devil or tapeworms in my belly, but I knew better on both cases. Will we see the new governor and his daughter, Angelina? Evelina asked, sniffing. She always kept a cold all winter and never had a handkerchief, so her eyes watered and her nose was a mess. I hoped she wouldn't be snotting inside the Capitol building. At least she wore her nicest coat, the brown velour one with a matching cap, which was nicer than mine. I just had my plain old blue corduroy coat and cap with the missing pom-poms. We don't go round to the governor's private quarters anymore, Mrs. Smithfield said. Not after some white schoolchildren caught a governor still in bed. After Mrs. Bivens let us off at the Capitol building, we entered through a back door past the guards. We stopped in a circular hallway called the Rotunda. Building the Capitol began in the 1790s, Mrs. Smithfield said. It caught fire in 1831. It was completed in 1840. And, Evelina, before you ask, no, I wasn't around when it was built. Evelina closed her mouth, smiling. Mrs. Smithfield handed her a handkerchief. Colored people like my grandpa Lassiter helped to build the Capitol, she said. I smiled proudly. We followed her up the stairs. I'm glad I don't have to scrub this place, I whispered to Angel May. After I scrub our kitchen and bedroom floors, my knees look like tree bark. On the second floor, we peered into the House of Representatives chambers. After the Civil War, many colored men got elected to the House and passed laws right in this room, Mrs. Smithfield told us. One of Cece's great uncles also served in the House, and only men? Angel May frowned. If I'd been around, I'd have voted for a lady. Well, women only got to vote in 1920, remember? This is 1921, but things are still slow for us colored, Mrs. Smithfield explained. I started to speak, but Evelina spoke over me again. Then Mrs. Smithfield got to jabbering some more. When things got quiet, I said, when I get grown, maybe I'll run for the legislature. Old mousy, you! Evelina arched up her eyebrows. If you tried to give a speech, nobody'd hear you. I shut up again. Well, I am going to be a doctor, I added to myself. Evelina and her big mouth, always talking over me. I had also wanted to say that Mama used to tell me about my great uncle what's-his-name in the house. Never mind now. Mrs. Smithfield said that a ghost man in old-timey clothes haunted the Capitol. But I've never seen any ghosts, she said, while I peered around, looking for anything shadowy. Ghosts don't eat, so they got no business in my kitchen, she said. Upstairs was a room that used to hold samples of every rock, mineral, and plant in North Carolina, she told us. But when General Sherman came through, people said his men stole all that stuff. I'm sorry about the rocks, but I'm sure glad he came, 'cause he helped to free our people from slavery." "Yay for General Sherman!" Evelina yelled, then clapped her hand over her mouth. Nobody else but the guards were around, but Evelina's big mouth must have bothered Mrs. Smithfield a little, because she hurried us through the rest of the tour. The next thing I knew, we were climbing back into Mrs. Bivens's wagon. I didn't mind. I'd seen enough. She dropped me off at the stackhouse so I could walk home with Papa. I sat down on a bench to wait. This way I wouldn't have to help Aunt Society fix dinner. I was her captive in the kitchen. She poked, pinched, and plucked at me, just like she did a dead chicken. And this has been a preview of Celeste's Harlem Renaissance.